Well, there is only, thank you first for this kind introduction. And there is only one answer to this, nah. But on a more serious note, I've put on my slides a rather bulky title about European research infrastructures and implementing the GDPR towards a code of conduct for health research. So what the title suggests is that there are basically three topics in my talk: research infrastructures, GDPR, and the code of conduct. Now, what about research infrastructures? Research infrastructures, for those of you who are not yet aware of it, are designed to facilitate and provide resources and services for research communities to conduct research and foster innovation. The idea is exactly to move away from this 3 to 5 year life cycle of projects and to move into the direction of having a sustainable infrastructure for researchers. Now, when we come to the biological and medical sciences, there are 13 research infrastructures that are also on the S3 roadmap that join together in the Corbel project and try to coordinate their services across each other, making it easier for the researcher not to contact each research infrastructure individually, but to go to one stop shop, so to say. Now, BBMRI ERIC is one of them, and within BBMRI ERIC we have one inside joke. If you can say what BBMRI, what the acronym stands for, then you can become a member. And if you can sing it without stumbling, then you're exempt from the membership fee. Now, BBMRI ERIC stands for Biobanking and Biomolecular Resources Research Infrastructure, European Research Infrastructure Consortium. I spare you the singing. The history of it all dates back being placed as an idea on the S3 roadmap, then for 3 years being granted European funding as an FP7 project to come up with a business plan and how it can work. And after the project ended, it took funders another 3 years, and as well as the scientists, to decide which legal entity we should go for and who is going to pay for it. Now, as you can guess, me standing here and the wonderful colleagues I have at the BBMRI headquarters, BBMRI does exist today as an ERIC, which means that it has the legal entity of a research infrastructure, is paid by its member states, and has no end date, in contrast to a research project. Now, BBMRI is from the start a federated research infrastructure and aims at facilitating the use of sample collections and data collections for the benefit of human health. Now, the backbone of BBMRI is, of course, not the headquarters, but the various national nodes in our 21 member countries. And we divide between members that have full voting rights. Members, as you see, are the countries, and observers that could also be international organizations such as IARC. Now, what do we offer? We offer, in essence, 3 key services: ethical, legal, and societal guidance, quality management services, IT tools, and expertise. And underlying it all is, of course, the question, what about the GDPR? And this is one of the key topics across all our services, leading to a lot of discussions. I like to bring up this slide because it's often forgotten that the GDPR is meant as a jack of all trades, or as in German we say, eierlegende Wollmilchsau, this beautiful animal here that is well intended but does not exist in reality, that produces wool, gives eggs, has some nice meat, and has a wonderful friendly smile. By no means this is intended as an advertisement for this car company. Now, the objective of the GDPR is also something that needs to be recalled when talking about the GDPR. The General Data Protection Regulation harmonizes the data protection rules in the European Union. The objectives of the regulations are to reinforce data protection rights of individuals, facilitate the free flow of personal data in the single market, and reduce administrative burden. That is the objective, that is the vision. Now, we learned today that harmonization is a dirty word somehow in our community. And nonetheless, it is not worth to throw out the kid with the bathwater, because even though harmonization is hard to achieve and will certainly not be achieved by tomorrow, it is something we should strive for. Now, the objectives again, and that is something I think we as researchers often forget, is the protection of rights of individuals on one side and the free flow of data in the single market on the other. And research in that sense is more in the intersection between the two. Reducing administrative burden, well, I will not comment on that right now. What I want to say is when the GDPR was in the making, this nice picture was shared by Jan Albrecht via LinkedIn. And Jan Albrecht is an MEP from the Green Party who was at that time the rapporteur of the GDPR at the European Parliament. And this image depicts clearly what his idea about the GDPR was. Well, research, at least medical research, does not exist. I mean, of course, this is always a simplified cartoon, but the individual is in the center, a nice hipster who just wants to put the next item to his shopping basket, surrounded by the evil companies that want his data and his money and his life. Now again, what about research? Well, it's a hard nut to crack. But it should not be forgotten that whether we talk about the GDPR or the Data Protection Directive from before, research still remains the exception. It has been before, it is now. The member states have more possibilities in terms of the derogations or take it up now. And we see that here harmonization is not yet on the horizon, unless I think we as researchers have to make the convincing argument what is exactly the case. And here we have to learn also how to do that on various levels. Nobody in the policy circles has the time and sometimes not the knowledge to read a bulk of research papers. Here you have the solution. We have to really make the case in a convincing way, and also taking into account that everything is always done with the best intentions. I at least have not met any policymaker that has tried really to put a stop on things, but where one has to work in a dialogue. Now for institutions, it is interesting how the GDPR implementation unfolds. It's somewhere in between spring cleaning, getting rid of old practices, updating policies, or to go in the other direction of overprotection. I recall one incident that I'm sure all of you know quite well when it comes to the innocent example of research projects. You have been asked, being a consortium member, to consent receiving information. Well, if you have been put on a mailing list without and receiving the information in first place, asking for the consent is anyways already a violation of the data protection law, and B, the basis for this is not consent. There is this misunderstanding that the legal basis always also has to be consent. And in this case, well, you have a very clear obligation to start up mailing lists. You have the consortium agreements, you have the description of action that specifies, well, obviously you have to talk and share and exchange with whatever means are appropriate with your consortium members. Now, coming back to the topic and coming back to BBMRI, what we did was, in a first step, assessing in a quick and dirty manner the draft of the GDPR and presenting frequently asked questions to give some orientation, but then to dig deeper as the national implementations are ongoing in various working groups and start in various degrees dialogue with EU and national policymakers, and that is still ongoing today. Again, I want to contextualize what I'm saying and present the status of the member state implementation as of May 2018. So that was a couple of days before the GDPR entered into force. And a few countries said they were ready. Some said that they're clearly not ready, and others said, well, we can make it by the next month. Now, I've taken as an example the Czech Republic, that just a couple of days ago managed to fully implement and adapt the GDPR into national law. That said, of course, the GDPR is a regulation, and by requirements in effect whether a country takes up its implementation or not. However, as we know, the devil always lies in the detail. And I find this statement of then President of the French Data Protection Authority, the CNIL, Isabelle Falk-Pietri, quite remarkable. Again, shortly when the GDPR entered into force, she said 17 out of 24 national data protection authorities report that their resources and manpower do not suffice to meet the obligations. It is not so much different today. So this also explains why it can be very hard for you to get a counterpoint at various national data protection authorities, and putting pressure on those guys also doesn't help. Again, to exemplify, Austria has a population of 8 million. The data protection unit before the GDPR had 3 staff members, then was getting 12. And obviously, as they have dealing with everything that concerns the general data protection regulation, an expert in research is yet not available. What we found while studying the GDPR text was Article 40 that we thought, again as BBMRI, could help to get more clarity and guidance and orientation into the practice for researchers. And Article 40 in essence says that a sector and associations and other bodies representing categories of controllers or processors may prepare a code of conduct. Now, BBMRI, in case we are the controller of the data, represent a certain sector. Further specifies the GDPR. I just highlight for the sake of time a few examples that sound familiar for you. Is the code can address issues on fair and transparent processing, exercise the rights of the data subjects, and the transfer of personal data to third countries or international organizations. Now, we took a step back and thought, whatever we are doing, it does not make sense to come up with a code of conduct for buybacks. We immediately thought bigger and thought of health research, identified with whom we could talk, and presented these original aims to a larger community, as I do also to you here today. So what are the aims of the Code of Conduct for Health Research? That is to contribute to the proper application of the GDPR, taking into account the specific features of processing personal data in the area of health, because it is different. To clarify and specify certain rules of the GDPR, especially for controllers. To help demonstrate compliance, here for controllers and processors, and ultimately to foster transparency and trust, because it is not for us, but at large for the citizenry that we are producing this code. Now, the levels of involvement that we came up with was to talk to, in various settings, to as many what we identified as stakeholders coming from industry, patient advocacy groups, and as well as research and the biomedical science research infrastructures, bring together a drafting group and to cluster all of these actors in a wider forum. We are still working on the text. We are already presenting to some of what we clustered from the forum in reference groups, key organizations, sections of the code, depending on the orientation. And we're looking for a dialogue with other groups in drafting of the code. To mention one of them is with other organizations that are drafting not in health research, but in other areas, a code of conduct, but equally so on the national level. So here I want to exemplify with on two initiatives. The Polish colleagues draft a code of conduct, a national one, very much so because in Poland the law does not regulate well enough how data processing is happening, and they have quite some good meetings in relation to working with the National Data Protection Authority. They had hoped to publish their code about a year ago. As you see, it is a process. Another initiative I want to mention is from various hospitals that are saying, well, a code of conduct in our regional hospitals definitely makes sense. And as any one of you know, cross-institutional work equally is not an easy task. Now, what are the focus areas of the code? Non-surprisingly, the lawfulness of processing, responsibility of the processor and controller, and their relationship, with a special focus on the burden of proof lying with the controller, the overarching principle of the GDPR, the accountability, talking about appropriate safeguards, but also specifying anonymization versus personal data, because we see that in practice and in the understanding and definition of member states, it is, although officially the GDPR does not concern anonymized data, in practice it is not so easy. And we aim with practical examples to refer always to existing guidelines if they already exist, especially in relation to soft law. Highlighting quickly when it comes to Article 9, the processing of special categories of personal data is A, first forbidden, and then B, allowed under certain conditions. And these lists also shows under which legal basis the data processing can be allowed. I've highlighted here the ones that most countries in Europe are going for. Now, the structure of the code is something that we aim to have as simple as possible, to follow the data process flow, and starting with the first question, am I handling personal and sensitive data? And closing in the current draft, what about data security? We aim to use a non-legalistic language and to build up on an FAQ style. Looking a bit further into the details of the code, I want to take the example of consent, because we found that there is the need to clearly differentiate when consent is a legal basis and when in the sense of the GDPR for data processing, and when informed consent is done to the research participation. It's a fine line that needs to be drawn. Now, what the code is and what the code isn't. It is not the Holy Grail. It is in its essence, something that can be useful for you when it comes to clarifying data protection code of conduct across Europe. And the big question is, of course, if the content is there, how to submit it and how to govern the code. What is the minimum criteria that such a code needs to contain? And here the EDPB has issued about a month ago its draft guidelines, which and is currently assessing the feedback it received to this public consultation exercise. And it means, it exemplifies in practice how a code should be implemented, where it should be turned in, how much time the Commission has, or the EDPB, National Data Protection Authorities, to comment and reply to the code, and how is the code modified and how is the adherence. In essence, the content is 50% of the text, and the governance is another 50%. The timeline for us is always shifting, also partly because the national implementation is not advancing or is equally a moving target. So this is the timeline where we are today, still optimistic. But the concluding slide, and then I'm happy to answer your question, is what we never should forget, whether there is a code or whatever we are doing, is wearing a t-shirt with "Trust me, I'm a doctor," in my case of philosophy, is never the way forward. Or as Bert Brecht put it much more eloquently, what destroys faith is invoking it. We've heard this morning a couple of times the sound of music, and I want to elaborate why I've put the image there. I'm sure that without knowing much about it, most of you have recognized this image. It is the sound of music. Now, you might think it is known everywhere. It isn't. I'm from Austria. Sound of Music is not shown on Austrian television. Don't assume anything. Take a step back and start a dialogue. Do you know Sound of Music? How do you deal with your data? How does it work? Thank you for your attention.
I think we are running a bit late, but I think we'll allow for one question. Yes.
Andreas Weser from NTNU in Norway. If an organization or a collaborative project wants to use your services, how much would it be, or is it free of charge because the member states pay for it?
The member states are paying for it, so it is free of charge for a researcher coming from the member state of the research infrastructure. And everybody else, for the moment, we're serving if we have the resources.
Thank you.